Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Wargame Red Dragon great? First released all the way back in 2014 as the third entry of the Wargame franchise, and continuing to get DLC a full decade later, even mind you following the release of two separate spiritual successor franchises, it is safe to say that Wargame Red Dragon has very much left its mark on the heart of RTS fans across the globe. But to understand why this is the case, let's talk about what exactly made the game great. And the first thing that made the game great has to be the legacy that built up to it, most notably the first two entries into the Wargame franchise. This is because entries in the Wargame franchise build heavily upon what the previous entries accomplished, while also making noteworthy additions and improvements where needed. To start off, European Escalation set the standards for the amount of depth that would be in the Wargame franchise, as well as the basic foundation of the deck building mechanics going into creating your armies. Air-land battle, for example, added in fixed-wing aircraft, as well as allowing players to use nation-specific decks, as well as creating the dynamic campaign system that would serve as a basis for the campaigns in Red Dragon. So as you could tell, Wargame Red Dragon was very much a case of building upon the foundations of the previous entries, whilst also making its own additions to the series. But there is one aspect introduced right from the very beginning of the franchise that I do believe warrants its own special attention. That would be the sheer amount of detail within the Wargame series. To be clear, I'm not talking about the graphics, though to be fair, the games are known for being nice looking, at least as far as RTS games are concerned, but instead I mean detail from a game design perspective. The sheer amount of stats that each of the various units within the Wargame franchise have are quite impressive indeed, making the individual units themselves stand out that little bit more from their counterparts, and their specific quirks being something that a skilled tactician will be able to get quite a good amount of mileage out of. But it is of note that these aren't just combat stats either for these units, as logistics is a very real factor in the Wargame franchise. It's very possible for tanks to run out of ammunition, or even fuel, something that you'll have to account for. On top of that, there's other under-the-hood factors to consider as well, as things like gun depression are even modeled within the game, meaning it's very possible to engage enemy tanks from a hull-down position in a way where they have to relocate just to be able to get a shot on your troops. On top of that, there are certain critical debuffs that can happen to enemy vehicles as well, such as losing their tracks, or their fire control system getting knocked out. And all of these things can have a massive impact, and can enable a skilled tactician to turn a seemingly impossible fight into an absolute turkey shoot under the right circumstances, taking units that on paper are vastly inferior to enemy units and mopping the floor with said enemy units. But as previously mentioned, this was a thing in previous Wargame entries as well, so let's move on to what exactly Wargame Red Dragon added to the formula. And one of the big game changes brought via Wargame Red Dragon was the naval focus of the game. Now granted, the naval exclusive maps aren't exactly the game's highlight, however it did also come with the inclusion of amphibious vehicles, meaning that certain land vehicles could cross waterways, albeit at varying speeds. This very much was a tactical game changer that made things like bridges no longer the choke points that they once were, and it also gave significantly more utility to the units that were in fact amphibious, making them excellent little flankers or reconnaissance vehicles, assuming that they had the optics for it. But that wasn't the only notable change that Wargame Red Dragon Dragon introduced. Another major change that helped make the game great was the introduction of the coalition system as well, which had a major impact on how you could build your decks. For those who are curious, the way the coalition system works in-game is that it allows you to combine 2 or 3 different nations without having to make a blanket blue 4 or red 4 deck. This is significant because certain nations are particularly good at covering the weaknesses of other nations while bringing their own strengths to boot. The classic example of this is of course Scandinavia, where the Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes all have their own unique strengths that they bring to the coalition. And while you can still play any of those 3 nations, or indeed any of the other nations separately, with the exception of the Anzacs that is, the coalition system itself is still nevertheless a very useful option when it comes to deck building, and adds so much more to the game as a result. These kind of changes are a great part of the reason why Wargame Red Dragon still remains relevant a full decade later, to the tune of even still getting new DLC. And again, this is a game that's managing to accomplish that despite not 1 but 2 separate successor franchises getting released since. Most notably the Steel Division games, as well as more recently WarGame. It truly speaks volumes about just how beloved Wargame Red Dragon is to still be getting that kind of attention a full decade later. With all of that in mind, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Wargame Red Dragon is great.